Hello, welcome to our webinar on China, how any U.S. company can survive a trade war with China. Certainly something that we're all very interested in. We've had our biggest turnout ever, as I was just telling our presenter. So I'm going to give a quick introduction to our presenter, John Tulak, and also just tell you a little bit about APIX. So this is APIX Inland Empire. So we're at www.apics-ie for inlandempire.org. We have lots of events just like this webinar coming up. We typically are doing webinars and tours, and we definitely have classes for certification. So check out our upcoming events webpage and join us at our events. We also have our flagship event, the Executive Panel and Networking Symposium, coming up in November. So we look forward to seeing you there. So with that said, I'll turn it over to John Tulak. John is recognized as one of the preeminent lawyers in the field of international law in California. He holds the highest rating for competence and ethics from the prestigious Martindale-Hubbell National Law Directory. He's a former judge pro tem, arbitrator and mediator for the Los Angeles Superior Courts, and an arbitrator for the State Bar Attorney Client Fee Dispute Resolution Program. He's a member of the California, American, and Los Angeles County Bar Associations, and he also teaches in his spare time at Cal Poly Pomona, and he's doing some visiting professor roles at some other colleges as well. So we have a world leading expert here on China. So John, we'll let you take it over and tell us all about what's happening.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Lisa, for the kind introduction and for inviting me to speak to your group today. This is a topic that I love to talk about because I have been involved with China for almost my entire legal career. I was admitted to practice in 1977, and in 1979, there was this brand new law, the Foreign Investment Law of 1979, that was going to open up a few special economic zones in China to foreign investment. I read that law, and it was one of those things as a young lawyer I realized nobody knows anything about this. And so I'm as much an expert in the United States as a lawyer looking at this as any other lawyer would be. And I was fortunate in getting a deal done in China very early, in about 1980, early 1981. And that changed my career path to emphasize a focus on international business law and China in particular. And I do business with the Chinese for my clients in multiple ways to this day. I am fascinated by China. It is an amazing country. They do so many things that are very different in approach and culture, in thought than how we do things. And so the potential for misunderstanding because of those differences can be very, very great. And of course, that's part of what today's presentation will deal with a little bit is how do you deal with China? We have our hands full as a country, but if we have a supply chain originating in China, or we've got goods that are coming from a distributor that are being produced in China and they're stocking our shelves, it's our problem too, on a microeconomic individual company basis, as well as a consumer individual choice kind of basis. So what do we do about this? So the topic is how any U.S. company can survive a trade war with China. And the subheading for that really is how to fight and win your own trade war, which is also a little bit misleading because nobody wins a trade war. There will never be a winner in a trade war. You can never win a tariff war, but you can win battles. We have battles going on now between China and the United States, primarily starting with the tariffs and the tit-for-tat kind of responses that we've seen. But this can expand. And if this does not get under control, if the parties don't come back and negotiate something, it definitely will expand. So we have to think of this as an economic war that could potentially really get out of hand, which could also lead to other forms of retaliation, such as in cyber warfare or even a shooting war. But even without those kinds of extremes, we have to remember that war is hell. And in any war, there will be casualties. And so part of what today is all about is how to avoid becoming a casualty. So for today's presentation, I'm relying on multiple sources. Some of those are publicly available things for simply reading daily newspapers and business journals and so on. Some of these come from confidential sources, both from my own network relative to China and from services that I subscribe to. So some of that, obviously, I will not attribute, but suffice it to say that as I'm accessing some of these materials, that there is conflicting expert opinion about some of this stuff. So I'll try to navigate through that in such a way that this is objective. I'll try and put my opinion and spin on some of it, but recognize that I'm trying to simulate and then make sense of and present what will be some multiple points of view.
Well, and John, I'm thinking that if folks have questions, they can't speak because otherwise there'd be a lot of background noise. So they're happy. You feel free to send in a question to Q&A or in chat, and I'll monitor that, John. And when you get to points where you want to answer them, I can read them off to you.
Right. Yeah. My goal is to reserve some time for exactly that. Because
okay. Perfect.
There might be some questions.
Very good.
Okay, so what does China want? And I phrase that as a broadly based question about what China wants and needs generally. Externally, as a country, as a country that has a long and proud history, what China wants is respect. And in terms of how it wants to accomplish a number of other things for the betterment of China, what China wants externally is access to resources such as crude oil that it must have in order to provide the energy that China needs. And access to world markets to get the resources that China needs is a critical part of everything that China does. And it's a Belt and Road Initiative, which it looks like a lot of favors being handed out. These loans and these business arrangements are designed to make friends around the world and to make China influential in those countries, whether it's a port facility or a power plant or other kind of infrastructure project or growing soybeans or what have you that they've done through wide swaths of the world. This is part of making sure that they have access to resources. Internally, what China has always prized and needed is order. China wants internally to be orderly. And that means it wants to be free of external threats, obviously, as well. And China wants growth. And China has achieved incredible growth in such a short period of time, economically speaking. It is an amazing accomplishment. But the growth rate has gone down substantially in recent years, and that is alarming to China. And so when you cannot employ the hundreds of millions of people who need to work at the same capacity that an overheated engine was able to do before, you run then the risk that order will break down. And so to understand some of what's going on with China today and why this trade war is more than it appears from our perspective, you have to understand internally that China has some serious problems, many of which are self-inflicted. So the place to start with that is Tiananmen Square. If you recall, we just came on June 4th, upon the 30th anniversary of that massacre of peacefully protesting Chinese people. That event doesn't exist officially in China. It has been wiped from any kind of national recognition. Of course, everyone in China knows about it, doesn't know everything about it because that's all been suppressed. But all of this current trouble inside of China is magnified in the minds of the Communist Party officials that basically control everything when you consider that this is an anniversary of significance. Magnifying that is the current unrest in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong was promised, when it was turned back over to China, part of the negotiation between the United Kingdom and China, Hong Kong was promised 50 years of not entire autonomy, but virtual autonomy. And China would not interfere with the one China, two policies approach. But of course, China has cheated on that, and a lot earlier than expected. And most recently, the protests in China have been over an extradition treaty that was introduced that would allow China to take certain kinds of people charged with certain kinds of crime to mainland China to stand trial. Well, trial in China versus trial in Hong Kong under the British system, which is what China still uses, would be markedly different. This would be a severe blow to what's left of democracy and a rule of law in a truly independent judiciary in Hong Kong. So no surprise, this is alarming to Hong Kong citizens, Chinese, non-Chinese alike, and we've seen demonstrations again in Hong Kong at a level that we haven't seen in 4 years. Over 1 million people out in the streets. Any kind of protest, any kind of visible display of unrest or disagreement is anathema to the Chinese Communist Party. This is a threat to order. This is a threat to growth. This is a threat to respect. And so on the anniversary, a 30-year anniversary of this horrific event, Tiananmen Square, you now have unrest in Hong Kong. This is worrisome. So this is the current backdrop. The next thing that we need to understand is that China's economy, as strong as it is in so many ways, is substantially weaker than ours. And China has multiple internal problems for which they do not have solutions. Their debt load is significantly larger than ours here in the United States. And we have reason to be worried about our national debt and about rising consumer debt again, and so on. China's debt load is an order of magnitude more serious than ours. They believe that the way to deal with things is by top-down management, imposing controls, restrictions, but we also have this unholy form of crony capitalism that allows the Chinese Communist Party people, especially the most significant members, as well as members of the military, to unfairly benefit economically by how things are set up, including these very, very cozy mammoth loans to state-owned enterprises or to private companies where there is favoritism shown because of a connection with officials. It's very corrupt. And so no surprise, you have a lot of bad loans that are made with little or no ability for those things to be repaid. So one of the things that's come from that is China now wants to control its foreign reserves. It wants to keep capital inside the country. It's always had capital controls in different ways. Now doing a real serious regime of enforcing capital restrictions, which is one of the reasons why a lot of money that was flowing here to the United States in the last year has dried up. the kind of money that was flowing routinely into Southern California, for example, to buy properties and turn them into McMansions and that sort of thing, that's virtually gone. That was one of the early casualties of enforcing rules against capital flight. If you're a Chinese company and you're trying to buy things externally and import them into China, getting approval to have those purchases made takes a lot longer, and you can be arbitrarily and capriciously denied. So you're a private company and you need something from outside of China, good luck with that. And of course, for foreign companies providing goods and services to China, then there's the risk of not getting paid because China will let the money flow out of the country. That's a problem, obviously. Currency, China's currency is weak and getting weaker. China has manipulated the currency just as we have charged China with. It does so in a number of ways, somewhat crudely by the standards of what our macroeconomic tools are like. And in fairness, we attempt to manipulate our currency too, as do most other countries, and to good or bad effect, depending on how well you play the game. China is having difficulty playing that game well, although they've gotten better at it in recent years, and they've also gotten better at doing it in such a way that doesn't invite criticism or retaliation. And for a couple of years, they were actually doing pretty well with that. Not so much at the moment. They don't really have a choice in that matter. They can't win that battle either. Because the other things that impact what the currency is worth are far more significant in terms of impact than what they can manipulate and control. They have a seriously overbuilt infrastructure. They spend a lot of money, billions and billions and billions of dollars every year building things that they don't need anymore, but it keeps people employed. Their greater concern is that if you do not keep people employed, they don't want to keep them in the cities where the work is or was, and if they leave them there and they're not working, they're concerned about unrest. So they have, in fact, taken people who do not get re-employed in a reasonable amount of time, and they load them up and send them back to the countryside and tell them not to return. Obviously, that's rather totalitarian, but no surprise, it also creates much greater resentment among people forcibly relocated. So that problem isn't going to go away. The overcapacity problem in terms of building up this infrastructure that nobody uses, allowing especially state-owned enterprises to continue to make things that nobody wants. By the way, that's not just solely a problem with state-owned enterprises. Even private companies were encouraged to overproduce, and they would borrow even when there were no sales until they reached the point of no return. Some of you may remember a few years ago, maybe 3 years ago, there was a picture in the LA Times of a private company in China that made these huge drums for cement mixers, the large industrial-sized cement mixers. And the company had just closed. The owner was shown in his warehouse area 300 of these mammoth mixers sitting there in a totally empty warehouse. Everybody had been laid off, doors shuttered. Nobody's going to buy these things. He was wiped out. And there's no bankruptcy law in China that allows you to do a reorganization or to get things back under control. There's a real estate bubble. Many of you have heard of that. Part of that overbuilding has created tens of thousands of empty units in apartment buildings, literally ghost cities. And in connection with that, properties that have been occupied, particularly in the major cities like Shanghai and Beijing, have had a run-up in value that is also overinflated. So sooner or later, the bill comes due on that. And then finally, a long-term problem that China has recognized and publicly is trying to deal with, and that's pollution. China is one of the most heavily polluted countries on earth. A lot of their arable land is unfarmable, and they've actually admitted to 20% of their farmland being unfarmable at the moment. The number is actually substantially higher than that, which is typical. The Chinese fudge their data as just a matter of course. But they have recognized that that's a problem. The runoff from caustic fertilizers and insecticides, things that help promote the Green Revolution inside of China, of course, where did that stuff go? It went into their waters, their navigable waters, their streams. Their water is really polluted. And in many parts of the country, there's a shortage of drinking water. This is obviously a survival kind of issue. You have to have water to live. Interestingly, one of the major areas where there could be a war would be along the border with India and Pakistan, because the waters of the Himalayas are contested in terms of where headwaters are and the control you might exert over that. China claims all of that. India and Pakistan obviously disagree, and they all need the water for life. So what happens with that is something that could become very, very dangerous in the future. So that brings us to the current dangers. This is something that was recently stated in the China People's Daily. So this is the official newspaper of China. This is the exact phrase directed to the United States about the tariff war that could escalate into a greater economic war. The phrase, "Don't say we didn't warn you." And the article is about how China can fight and win a trade war with the United States. This is the third time that particular phrase has been used in the People's Daily. The first time it was used, it was directed against India, and there was a war subsequently with India in 1962, border clash. The second time it was used was in 1979 against Vietnam. And of course, there was a brief shooting conflict with Vietnam in 1979. Americans have pretty much forgotten about both of those things. And it brings to mind Ambrose Bierce's famous line in the Devil's Dictionary that war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. Because the only time we ever pay attention, it seems, to the rest of the world is when there's conflict or the threat of conflict. Pretty cynical kind of thing, but I am appalled by the lack of knowledge about geography that I see from my otherwise very intelligent and highly educated college students. They don't know and understand geography today. So geography plays into the one card that we have good reason to worry about really hurting us, at least in the short term. And that is that virtually the entire world's production of rare earths takes place in China today. And we need the rare earths. There's something like 26 of these strategic kind of metals, and they're called rare earths because although they are actually commonplace around the world, concentrations of them are fairly rare. So we have trace amounts of these everywhere, but there are actually only a handful of places where it's then economically possible to mine and produce these things for economic use. One of those places, by the way, is in the United States. But we closed that mine a number of years ago. It then went through a couple of different transitions in ownership. It was reopened, it went into bankruptcy. The current ownership has as one of the owners, as a minority partner, a Chinese company. How about that? So we need the rare earths for all kinds of stuff in automobiles and iPhones and anything that depends on electronics or alloys, anything that's high-tech oriented. We depend on one or more of these strategic rare earths in order to actually make this stuff. So when China says, we can cut you off, that would indeed hurt. And there's no ability to replace that production on a short-term basis. It's impossible. The existing facility in the United States may be back into production by 2020. Of course, that could be accelerated to move it up earlier in 2020. And there was a good article in the LA Times a couple of weeks ago about the threat of being cut off from rare earths. And someone from the Department of Defense said, yes, this is indeed worrisome, and we don't have a replacement for it in the near term. And this is a matter of national security. And we need to be prepared for the future, blah, 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 typical bureaucrat talk. Well, guess what? China cut us off from rare earths temporarily, cut off everybody temporarily in 2010. And the result of which was a huge spike in the price of those things. And we've had 9 years to have learned from that experience. We've had 9 years to open up production here in the United States or in other places around the world where you're not dependent solely on one location, one country for something that we need every day. We didn't do it. And that's just really inexcusable if you think about it. So this is something that China could do to hurt us in the short term, but I view this as a hammer. It's a heavy hammer. It would hurt if you hit with it. But right now they're threatening to raise it and they're threatening to use it. And remember, Sun Tzu's Art of War, that was a Chinaman who wrote this a long, long time ago. And the Chinese understand that the threat of using something is oftentimes stronger than actually wielding it. And so China does not want to play this card. It isn't going to play it unless it feels backed into a corner and has no other choice. But play it will if it gets into that position. So we have to think about how we handle that. The "don't say we didn't warn you" is a really, really seriously strong message. Don't mess with us. They're looking for a way to back this down. They do not want to feel like they're a cornered rat and have no alternative but to fight. And it would be foolish for us to treat them that way. Surprisingly, the military has been fairly quiet in terms of making pronouncements about that, but that's one of the things that we need to constantly monitor is what does China's military say, and significantly, what level of official, what rank of person is making that statement. So the more controversial, alarming statements will initially come from a lower level military official like a colonel. And that's a trial balloon to see what kind of reaction it gets. If it's a brigadier general, they're escalating the possibility that, we might actually do this. If it's a senior general, watch out. They intend to do this. So far, the military is relatively quiet on the front of the trade war. But remember, the military controls so much of economic activity in China through this crony capitalism that if the military people who are making all the money are feeling threatened, they're likely to look for ways of involving the military in a solution. Would that be a direct shooting war with the United States? Of course not. They would do everything, as would we, to prevent that from happening. But an increase in cyber warfare would be likely, but more likely, well, I shouldn't say more likely, but as likely would be some misdirection, which would mean in encouraging Iran or North Korea to keep us busy with something else. Well, guess what? North Korea, has resumed some missile testing. Iran appears to be involved in attacking tankers. Coincidence? I wonder. And of course, that's something we may not know about in terms of whether or not the military intelligence we're gathering on this front would be actually disclosed to us. But it's worrisome, to say the least. So, all by way of introduction to bring us to what can we do about this as individuals, as companies, as not wanting to be casualties in what's going on with this. So let's start with what can we do as a consumer? All right. Remember the old song, if you're old enough, you remember the Buy American campaign that unions had promoted quite some time ago. And they even had the song that was constantly on television and radio for a while, look for the union label. And so if you don't like what China's doing, then don't buy Chinese goods. Do your own boycott. Check where something is made and find an alternative to it that's made somewhere else, or do without. If you haven't noticed lately that most of our socks are not made in China anymore. A lot of them are made in Africa, in several different countries, and in Thailand, and you do have a choice for some of these everyday consumer products. If you're a seller of imported goods and you're relying on distributors for where the goods are coming from and what you're putting on your shelves, go take inventory of where your goods are currently coming from, and you're probably going to see that a substantial amount of what's on your shelf, if you're selling consumer products, or even if you're selling industrial products like hoses and connectors, or electronic parts, or something like that. So you might be business to business. You're going to see so much of that stuff's coming from China, but they're not sole source producers of that stuff. And you say, well, yeah, but that stuff is more expensive coming from Thailand or Malaysia or Indonesia or Mexico or what have you. Well, look at your all-in costs, and especially with a 25% tariff on it. And if you're going to have to pay the higher cost, if your consumer is going to end up paying the higher cost anyhow by way of the tariff, then take that 25% difference and buy the goods somewhere else. Chances are it's not going to be 25% higher. In fact, what's happened over recent years is that China is no longer the lowest cost producer for a lot of the things that they're still selling very successfully. But inertia, keeps you buying from China, from your existing suppliers, and it's just easier to do that than to go find somebody somewhere else to save only a couple of pennies. But it's like what Everett Dirksen said about the national debt back in 1968, when we were trying to have a peacetime economy and a wartime economy, funding the war in Vietnam at the same time. He was asked about whether he was concerned about the growing deficit, and his response in his gravelly voice was, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. I suppose after a while it's serious money. Well, the government can get away with that, but we as individual consumers or as companies certainly don't think that way. So it makes sense to look at alternatives. And as a matter of principle, I have always stated to my clients as I'm helping them in particular things, and this particularly would come up with respect to sourcing for doing an infrastructure project, is you never want to depend on a sole source supplier unless there's no choice. There's only this company and it's a unique product, and we can't get what we want exactly for our need any other place. Most of the time we have choices. And so this is an opportunity to diversify your supply chain. And that's a really serious thing that every company should look at doing. If any of you have heard my main China presentation, which I do every year, it's called Whither China, and it's updated regularly. One of the things that I've been saying since I started doing this presentation a number of years ago now is you have to have a plan B. What happens if your supply chain that originates in a single country or primarily in a single country gets disrupted? And in the Whither China presentation, I talk about all the ways by which a supply chain that originates in China can get disrupted. So what's your alternative? Where are you going to go if it's not here? So you have to have that in place, and you have to be able to implement it as soon as possible. And in this case, if you don't have an alternative, it's time to find it. And that's the thing that I think is the most serious part about fighting and winning your own trade war. How to survive a trade war with China is that you can no longer be dependent upon what China does.
World Cup is in action.
What in the world is interfering here? Hang on a second.
Went right there, grabbed my girls and said,
Don't you love technology, right?
You know, that my cell phone rang, and then this thing came in. Oh, I see where it's going.
I took them to.
Yeah, there we go. You click one thing and you get another thing. But see, things go wrong. You gotta have a plan to fix them. So diversifying your chain of supply, I think, is the single most important thing that any country can do as a matter of policy. And it is certainly the single most important thing that any company can do in order to survive what might be a protracted battle or war over tariffs and trade and other issues. And make no mistake, we have a serious need to address problems in China in terms of how they behave on the world stage economically. They cheat with the WTO regulations. They are all in terms of signing all of the patent and intellectual property recognition treaties. In fact, that stuff precedes Mao, but they don't follow it. And so we have real need to protect our intellectual property, to make sure that we're not being cheated on in China and so on. There's a lot at stake here. But the only role that we can play if we want to survive and thrive while all that gets battled out is we can't be dependent solely on China. So diversifying your chain of supply is the single most important thing that you can do. You need to have your plan B, and guess what? The plan B might then very well become your plan A. And China knows this. China knows I'm no longer the sole source, single, low-cost producing country in the world. I know that ultimately a lot of what built up China economically is production that's going to go elsewhere. I know that Mexico's already on parity with us when you take all in costs, including transportation and logistics costs and so on. And they also know that because of the one-child policy, they can't grow internally to the point of stability. So that relying on a vibrant exporting economy is absolutely essential. And they don't have a solution to that. So it's in our best interest to help them with that rather than fight them about that. But right now, we're simply not on the same page. So find that plan A. But in the meantime, get the plan B, which may lead to the plan A going. One final thing, and then we'll open it up to questions. This is something that may not seem like it makes intuitive sense if you're not currently involved with having your intellectual property at all in use in China. But it's a really good idea to register your trademarks in China. Even if you don't have a need for that, even if you're not planning on selling in China, by registering your trademark in China, you're preventing somebody else from taking that. Because one of the few things that China's regulatory Agency for Intellectual Property is doing is affording a lot more respect to foreign trademarks. And it also gives you some leverage if you do in fact have intellectual property in use in China. You know, your trade secret protection is only as good as the relationship you have with the party that's using your intellectual property either to produce goods for you and send them back here, or otherwise under license to sell on your behalf inside of China or elsewhere. Those are things which ultimately in any trade dispute we would hope get resolved in favor of recognizing and enforcing our intellectual property rights. But right now, the only way that you have of securing the enforcement of intellectual property rights is carefully choosing the counterpart that you do business with. And by developing a good relationship, once that trust is built, once that relationship is built, they won't cheat on you. They will not cheat on you. That's part of the Chinese business culture. But unless and until you get to that point, it's more like the caveat emptor principle. You know, I can do what I want. It's up to you to catch me. And so a lot of companies don't even recognize that their goods are being knocked off and sold out the back door, even though they otherwise appear to have a substantially good relationship with their Chinese suppliers. And so that is something that is within your hands to do, is develop those relationships, build them for the long term, build the trust, build it to the point where they won't cheat on you. And if you don't get that feeling from the parties that you're currently doing business with, and you still feel the need to be in China, try and find another supplier. Try and find a way to make it work. Chinese and American business people have found a remarkable ability to work together in a lot of ways. And so while we may be at loggerheads with each other as countries with clashes of interest, you know, microeconomically speaking, you know, we have common cause with our Chinese counterparts to find ways to make things work. So I encourage you, if your supply chain in any way originates in China, you know, be in touch with your Chinese counterparts. Figure out ways to deal with it legally, obviously, to ameliorate against the negative impacts of this. Tariffs generally don't last forever, and when they do, we're going to have, you know, serious global economic consequences, as we saw the Great Depression. You know, grew in large part out of tariffs and retaliatory tariffs. It helped create the Great Global Depression and perpetuated it. We spent our way out of that courtesy of World War II. We certainly can't afford to do that as a solution again. With that, I will open it up for questions. And I thank you very much for your kind attention. This is the tip of the iceberg in terms of all things China. And I encourage you to just keep informed, keep involved.
So, John, there is one question here about how will Taiwan be affected by Chinese tariffs? Are they exempt, and do they use their own policy?
Yeah, that's a separate policy. Remember, Taiwan is part of one China as far as mainland China is concerned. So China will periodically rattle the saber, as it has done recently with Taiwan. And it has no choice, because we've kind of changed the rules of engagement with China in the Trump administration in terms of treating Taiwan rather more like the independent country, which it really truly is in form and in substance. And so that has been a diplomatic loss of face for the People's Republic of China. So China has retaliated somewhat against Taiwan. And I would expect that that could continue.
But it sounds like if you have supply coming out of Taiwan, they're not subject to the same tariffs as China. So from that point of view, it could be good.
Right. So Taiwan, of course, has a substantial manufacturing capability in its own right. And for many years, of course, Taiwan business people were not allowed to do business in mainland China directly. But Chinese business culture being what it is, they found multiple ways of doing that indirectly. And then, there's no longer a need for that anymore. Taiwan, I'm sure, has any number of companies that are very much dependent on the relationships that they've built in mainland China. And so anything that, in terms of blowback from what's currently going on, directed at Taiwan could have negative economic impact on those companies. So Taiwan would be as interested in bringing this all down as we are.
Okay, all right, very good. And then there's another question here. Isn't the Chinese government, by its very nature, have more control over private companies? If so, how resilient can business relationships be?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's true. So there are basically a couple different kinds of private companies in China. The state-owned enterprise isn't really truly a private company, even though it might appear to have private ownership. It's essentially owned and controlled by the state, so we don't really count that. But the private companies are either truly private with little or no connection with government officials, and then the ones that are part of the crony capitalism, which means that they are totally either secretly owned or controlled by government people or military people, or they can't do anything without getting favors from the government. So it's a very corrupt kind of process. So it doesn't matter what kind of private company you have. Remember, it's a rule of law instead of a rule by law in China. So any private company can be subjected to arbitrary and capricious government action by a regulatory body or by a complaint being brought, and now you're in Chinese court. And despite the fact that, at least on its face, China has rules of evidence now and rules of civil procedure and so on, in a serious case, the judge, who's not truly independent, is going to call the local Communist Party official and say, what do you want me to do with this? And until China eliminates that and creates a truly independent judiciary, that's going to continue to be a problem. Interestingly, I train Chinese judges and Chinese regulators a couple of times a year. It's a privilege for them to come to the United States. It's a 2 or 3 week junket where they get education and training, and they also get to do some sightseeing. So they come to Southern California first. They get training through Cal Poly's extended university program, and then they go shopping at the Ontario Mills Mall, which is where they all want to go. And then they will either go to Washington or New York, and they get some more education. They get to tour some government facilities and so on. So the Chinese judges that I've had the privilege of interacting with for a few days, they're remarkable people, but they also want to live. So right. They're not going to buck the system, but part of what I talk about is the need for that independence. The Chinese regulators that I've trained the last couple of years have all been from the IP side, and I am amazed at their knowledge and ability. And in fact, they've been given a brief by the government to do a better job of preventing at least certain kinds of misuse of intellectual property. I view that as a very positive development.
But it sounds like, John, or tell me if this is a reasonable summary of what you just said, is that really you can't count on what the government could come in at any time and change something, is what you're really saying. However, if you get to a point in a business relationship where you have a really strong relationship, a real one, not where you think it is, but they don't. So when you get to the point where it's really strong, they won't lie to you, but that doesn't mean that they're willing to die for you, if you will. So they still, I guess they would tell you the truth, but the government could change their mind. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Right. And so that's why the relationship is so important, because if in fact there would be external pressure put on a privately owned company, a truly privately owned company, they'll find a way to tell you.
Okay. Oh, so that basically you can, yeah.
Yeah,
But that's also why you're saying make backup plans because you really just can't count on what could happen.
right,
That's what you're saying. So we
right.
have another question here. What can you conclude from the Chinese government's aggressive actions in the South Sea? Artificial islands, maritime, territorial disputes.
We could spend a couple hours on that. So this is part of what goes into what China calls respect. Historically, China has, as part of wanting order, has had to defend itself against outside aggressors. And so it has always tried to push the boundaries, the defensive perimeter out as far as possible. So the Great Wall is a perfect example. And of course, the Great Wall, like any other wall, was ultimately a failure against incursion. It wasn't good enough. And so the South China Sea is part of China asserting a defensive perimeter. This is our sphere of influence. We are, after all, China. We have a 5,000-year-old culture. We're the big country. All the rest of you are lesser countries. And so you must be respectful of our territorial demands. That's part of it. The other part of it is South China Sea is full of resources, particularly crude oil, and China wants all of it. So they're going to be very aggressive. They are going to be provocative. These building out of artificial islands to the point where you can land a military plane on it. They're now putting military stationed on these little spigots of spats of land. This is very typically how China does things. It does things in increments and sees how much it can get away with. And once they figure out there's nothing you can do about it, or it's reached the point of no return where you can't do anything about it, then they will aggressively move to exploit that. That's what they've done in the South China Sea. There's not much you can do to stop that, short of risking a serious incident. So we're sailing our fleet periodically into what are really, under the rules of engagement, territorial waters, and then China will, buzz the fleet with overflights, or bring a destroyer up close to the fleet and turn back. Any one of those incidents could result in a mishap, and then we've got a crisis. They've done this to every country with ships in the South China Sea. So it is a flashpoint. It's going to continue to be a flashpoint. It's also a place where so much in the way of goods are transiting from one place to the other, and China can stop that. Its navy is relatively small, but they are aggressively growing the navy. You have choke points leading in and out of the South China Sea in several places, so relatively easy for China to intercept or blockade if it wanted to really make a statement about the South China Sea. And it's one of the other ways by which supply chain, even if it doesn't originate in China, can be disrupted by what China does.
Yeah, very true. On a different topic, for like if you already have supply coming from China, and I know that you've mentioned on prior webinars that they might just reduce the quality over time. I mean, these things do happen. Do you have recommendations for how to, like what we should do about this to make sure that we're staying on top of that? Or is there something we can do to try to make sure that we don't end up with degraded quality over time, as an example?
Right. And that is a coping mechanism that even in a very good relationship, a Chinese business person might feel compelled to do because of other pressures on the company. So they'll cut corners. And it's nothing personal. They'll tell you that, and of course they won't admit to cutting corners unless you call them out on it. But the one thing that you can do is periodically inspect your supply agreements. Should definitely have a very, very strong quality control standard and review process to make sure that that all stays in place the way you expect it to be. You obviously, worst case scenario, you pull your supply relationship away and go elsewhere. But of course, that's disruptive. That takes time, and so you have to keep on top of it. And again, relationship will come first. If the relationship is good, they will send you signals that they're stressed. Oftentimes it will not be something that's obvious. They will say, we must increase prices. And you may have a clause that may limit that to cost. Well, you need to have a real discussion about what is going on there. The other thing that you can do, and this every U.S. attorney I've talked to, except for a handful who really know and understand and do a lot of business with China, will tell you. Typically, the U.S. lawyers will say, write it so that it's enforced under international arbitration, because China actually has behaved very well relative to arbitration of international disputes if a problem arises. But a handful of us are now saying that China courts have evolved to the point where if you rewrite your agreement, and you do it in two languages, so you got to have it written in Chinese and in English, and you make the Chinese language the official interpretation, the primary of the contract, and you call for resolution of the dispute using China law and China courts. So far, this has resonated well with the Chinese judiciary. Say, you respect us. It also resonates really, really well with your Chinese counterpart. They say, you trust us. And so, yes, there is a risk there. It's a risk that we're not fully able to evaluate yet, but the initial view is that this is one way where if there is a problem that comes up, you have a reasonably good chance of getting it resolved in a Chinese court in a manner that's favorable and enforceable. So the difference is with arbitration, you get a monetary judgment, and yes, you can get it entered as a judgment, but you may not be able to get it enforced. You get a judgment in China under Chinese law in a Chinese court, Chinese judges will enforce it. And so that's the wild card. That's the thing that we're now trying to figure out. When and how would we recommend doing that versus keeping it more at arm's length?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Very, like you said, it's a really interesting conversation on China and all that we need to be thinking about. So from that point of view, if one of our partners here wanted to contact you to talk about international law in China, how would they do that?
Well, easiest way, I have a website. It's just my name, johntulak.com. All my contact information is there. The center of my global economy is where my office is, which is beautiful downtown Claremont. So I can be found, and please feel free to distribute my contact information to the participants. I welcome any conversation about China.
All right, very good. We will definitely do that. And John, it's been really interesting. I've taken notes myself so I can make sure I pass it on to clients. So thank you for your for going through this with us. We appreciate it. And for the attendees, check out johntulak.com and also apix-ie.org for more. Well, actually, we're going to end up posting this webinar on the APIX website and also, for our future events. So we're right on the top of the hour, or 1 minute prior. So I think we're good to go. Any last minute, what's your last piece of advice, John, that you would want everybody to walk away with?
When I tell everybody the famous Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, John. And we'll talk to you on the next webinar in the future.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Good luck, everybody.
Thank you.